Welcome to We Need to Name This, where we unpack the hidden curriculum of academia with scholars of color. I'm Laura Ann Jacobs, and my co-host,
Ebony Pruse Harvey.
And today's episode is entitled, So I Have to Teach, Now What? And we would like to introduce an amazing scholar of color, Reuben Riggs-Bookman, who will share his experiences with us. Reuben is a doctoral candidate in anthropology and history at the University of Michigan. Thank you for joining us, Reuben, and welcome.
Thanks so much. It's exciting to be here.
Yeah.
So we have a ton of questions for you, but we like to start out every interview just finding out from our interviewee a little bit about themselves. So tell us a bit about your area of study, your current position as a doctoral candidate, and what brought you to academia.
Yeah, so hi everybody, first of all. My research is both ethnographic and historical, hence why I'm in a program that's a joint program in anthropology and history. And I look at race and democracy and urban governance in the Midwest. So currently I'm doing my dissertation research on a kind of wild policy in Michigan that allows the state to come in and basically take over democratically elected municipal governments. And that entails both kind of uncovering the history of this policy and looking at how it transforms the way city government works for the places that are taken over. My current position in academia is just as a PhD candidate. I'm in a program that more or less takes about 7 years. I'm on year 4, or just finishing year 4, which is insane to think about how long this whole thing takes. And I came to academia really by way of my kind of like political commitments. Before I came to the University of Michigan, I went to undergrad in St. Louis and was a community organizer for a couple of years after I graduated. And that period when I was in St. Louis coincided with the Ferguson uprising. So as someone that was already interested in criminal justice reform and community-based organizing, when that popped off, it really kind of transformed the way I saw the world and how I kind of thought about my political commitments. And there was so much, about that was incredibly powerful and moving and inspiring. But there's also a lot about it that was uninspiring and, that didn't pan out the way that I thought. And so one of the reasons why I ended up going to academia was about kind of searching for answers for questions that came up while I was trying to practice politics. I didn't feel like I had the tools to answer with what was out there at the moment. So I figured maybe there will be something useful about kind of really uncovering the way power works so that people that are on the ground that are doing things can really kind of get a better sense of who do they need to like push on, what do they need to do in order to get things to change at the city level, which is why I'm thinking about race, democracy, and urban governance now. But this is really this kind of question of what am I doing in politics and how do I actually do something useful for it that sent me to academia?
Thanks, Reuben. So I wanted to ask a follow-up. So you talked a bit about your political commitments bringing you to academia. I was wondering, in what ways do you think your political commitments connect to your teaching and how it inspires the work that you do as an instructor, as an educator?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think when I was an undergrad, I thought that maybe, or what my experience was I connected to some really rad professors who really inspired me. And the kind of my entry into kind of community organizing in St. Louis was absolutely through my professors at the school that I was at. And for me, I learned about kind of social inequalities and social justice and was given a bunch of tools to kind of reevaluate my life. And I said, oh my God, I need to move. Like I need to do something about this. And so I thought that when I started teaching that I might have that experience with other students. And that's what I was really kind of like hoping for. That was not my experience at all. And I think that happened on a couple levels. Like one is that as a graduate student instructor, at least at the University of Michigan, and I think this is the case at a lot of schools, you don't really get to choose what you're teaching. So if a professor hasn't designed a course to encourage that kind of political exploration, you're probably not going to have as many kind of opportunities to encourage that in your students. So that's certainly been the case for a lot of the classes I've taught, not all of them. Then the other factor is that a lot of the students that I teach here at the University of Michigan come from white middle class, upper middle class backgrounds, and the same kind of sense of urgency just maybe isn't there. So it's hard. I was hoping to inspire little kind of like Black Panthers, and I think what I actually get to do is to take someone that's maybe at a 2 and push them to a 3. So I think that's how my kind of like politics comes in with the teaching.
Yes, you bring up a really good point. That we're institutions that were not created to be sites of political activism, right? And so often students of color, graduate students, actually bring those tools to the university, but there's not always the opportunities to then use those tools or teach those tools, depending on how your maybe department is structured or courses are structured, or the amount of freedom you have to create or redesign courses. So I think that's really important for folks to know, that depending on how much flexibility your department has, you may teach courses that may not necessarily align much sometimes with your stance, right? And so, and then thinking about how those courses are created by professors and not necessarily something that you get to create. I know for me, at the School of Education, there was a course that I took over, and I had the freedom to redesign the course once I hit particular standards. And so that was totally awesome.
Yeah.
And I was able to then explore my own political commitments in the work that I do. But that's not what it looks like across the board. It can look, and the thing is that in one university, it can look very different from department to department to department. So you bring up
Absolutely.
a really great point, that depending on what your department is, how much freedom you have, whether they're even interested in designing new coursework. Sometimes you go into a department and they're like, oh, we're revamping our program. And it's like, oh, here's some ideas, and I want to teach that course. But that's not always the case. So I want to ask you a few more questions. One about your teaching, like what courses did you teach? We know that, we often teach a part of our graduate studies. So like when we get in there, part of getting maybe funding is like, hey, we're going to work for you all. We're going to be instructors. And so is that your experience? And then did you teach on both the undergrad and graduate levels, or did you just maybe teach undergrad or graduate students?
Yeah. Okay. So there's kind of 3 questions there. There's how is this tied to my funding package? What courses have I taught, and who did I teach? So yeah, my funding package was similar to a lot of students. I got a few years of fellowship, which is kind of just like you get to do your research, you take your classes, you do your thing, and then a couple years were tied to being a graduate student instructor or a graduate student researcher. So for most people in my program, people end up being GSIs, or they do the teaching route. And so I did that for 2 years, and hopefully I'll do it again, although I'm no longer like required to do it. I think in the future, if I teach, I would like to be able to teach my own course, which is another option for more advanced students. So the courses I've taught for 4 semesters, but only 3 different courses. So I taught one course twice. One was a history course called History of the Economy. And it was a very kind of like from kind of cavemen to the present, what is the economy? Interesting. This type of course that comes across as a very kind of introductory history course so that was kind of like part of, I think what was interesting about that was teaching an introductory thing. And I taught a course called Crime, Criminalization, and Punishment, which was a team-based learning course in anthropology, led by, I mean, all of these were led by really fascinating professors, but a really badass scholar in particular in anthropology, Melissa Birch, here at the University of Michigan, led that course. And then I also taught in honors college a course called, actually, I don't even remember the name of it, but it's about corporations, the modern corporation, I think of what it was, is how does governance work in corporations and what role do they play in our society? And I taught that course twice, actually. And in all of those teaching experiences and all the ones I imagine for myself in the future, it's been with undergraduates. When I think back on like what has been the kind of most fulfilling parts of my graduate teaching or my graduate experience, it has been teaching undergraduates. They bring a lot of energy. They are excited about life in a way that a lot of jaded grad students are not always.
We're not excited about life, really?
I mean, maybe I'll speak for myself, I guess, but you know, it's fun, it's relational. And I think so much of the kind of graduate experience is isolating. But when you're teaching, you get to build relationships with people. And for me, that's absolutely why I do all of this. You know, my political grounding is in communities. And this is the most kind of communal part of this whole academic experience.
So, so you taught undergraduates. And so my question is, you mentioned a bit about the great things about teaching undergraduate students, right? They come with the energy that us graduate students seem to be lacking. But they, you know, they're excited about the content and things like that. So I wanted to get your perspective on like any other affordances of teaching undergrads and some maybe like challenges of teaching undergraduate students. And I'm just thinking about folks who've never taught like formally coming into a university and saying, okay, you're teaching some first years or some third year junior graduate students, undergraduate students. What might be some challenges they might face and how might they be able to overcome those challenges?
Great. So yes. I think when I was thinking about applying to graduate school and people said you might need to teach as part of this, I was like, you must be crazy because I don't have anything to offer was kind of what I thought. And I said, like, how will I become an expert in this, whatever topic? I'm not an expert at anything. I can't teach anybody any of it. And I think one of the benefits of teaching undergrads is that that question was kind of born out of a thinking that teaching was all about kind of imparting content. And that's actually not the kind of like thing that you're trying to do with undergraduates. With undergraduates, you're trying to inspire a kind of pursuit of knowledge. You're trying to help them develop a sense of how to ask questions, of how to read things, how to like form an argument, you know, to think about evidence. And these are skills that you, as someone that's entering undergraduate school, absolutely already have, and certainly like are more advanced than most undergraduates. And so the question is not really like, are you an expert in this content field? It's really like, do you know how to ask questions of something that you've read? Do you know how to kind of digest it? And I don't know if that's always true with graduate student education. I've never taught grad students, so I couldn't speak to it, but it certainly felt like an advantage coming into teaching undergrads that I didn't have to be a master in the topic. I just had to know how to ask questions. You know, one of the challenges I think maybe of teaching undergrads, and I think this is kind of very particular to like where grad students are located in their own kind of journey into academia, is that sometimes it's easy to over-identify with them. I'll speak for myself. You know, when my students came to me and they were stressed about their grades, you know, I was stressed about their grades because I know what that feels like. And I certainly remember kind of like panicking when I was an undergrad about my grades. And so I think sometimes there is a little bit of a, you start kind of like empathically like oversharing, you know, and kind of like your emotional self with students. Not that, you know, I shared any information with them, but just kind of like I feel for them. So I can kind of feel a little bit draining at times when you can see somebody kind of like going through a lot and stressing a lot and you're wanting to give, but you do also need to kind of like protect yourself. So there's like a kind of a little bit of a vulnerability there, of being so close to the experience that they've had.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I'm gonna pass it off to Laura Ann, and she's gonna ask you a few more questions about teaching.
Great.
Thanks, Ebony. Thank you for sharing about your experience, Reuben. And I know you mentioned earlier that you were community organizer in St. Louis, and then you also said, you know, when I found out I had to teach, I was like, oh, okay. I'm not an expert in anything. That's such a strange thing to hear from you, because I feel like I admire so much your expertise in a lot of things. We've had the opportunity to share learning spaces together, and I've always really admired you. So yeah, I'm interested. You know, there may be people in different disciplines who enter with that mindset. That's very, I think, I don't know, can I say it's typical that people will say, I can't teach anything? And so I'm wondering, you know, now that you can look back, are there parts from your experience, either as a community organizer or other parts of your life, that when you think now about having taught for 2 years at the university level, are there skills or things that when you started, maybe you wish you had acknowledged as things that you brought to the table that were strengths in teaching that weren't labeled formal teaching? You know, what are some of those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so spot on. I don't know that I think I did anticipate a little bit after I got here. Like, so I had a year of fellowship before I started teaching, and the more I kind of like thought concretely about what is this teaching thing going to be, I think I did start to think, what from my experience can I draw upon to inform this thing that I'm about to do. And so for me, the organizing was absolutely the central part. As an organizer, I did a lot of like facilitation with people. I did a lot of like one-on-one relationship building and trying to develop leaders is what kind of like the organizers kind of talk about. It's like, how do you push people to kind of take on a little bit more responsibility, to take ownership over the kind of like issues that they're facing. And those are the kinds of skills that I thought, okay, I can bring these to the classroom. I know how to help build community. I know how to make people feel like they're a part of this thing, so that they take the next step, even if I don't necessarily know the content, you know. So when I think that those experiences, those kind of like previous skill sets that I had, have absolutely become the kind of very core and the foundation of my kind of pedagogical approach now. So when I think about how people learn, content is honestly one of the last things I think about. I think first about what kind of community do I want to build? Because when people feel connected to one another, when they feel safe, they can take kind of intellectual leaps. They can be intellectually or politically reflective and vulnerable, but they're not going to ever make those kinds of leaps unless they're in an atmosphere where they feel like they can do that. So for me, one of the most important things that I felt like I was bringing to the classroom is really just like being a human, making things less alienating whenever possible. You know, I did this like really kind of like very simple thing at the start of teaching every single day, where I would ask, I would have every single student answer the question, but I would ask some kind of corny thing about like, tell us about your like worst fashion moments from your adolescence or whatever, you know, something cheesy it doesn't take hardly anything to answer. It's just a couple minutes, but when you do that every single day with people, people start to get to know who they're sitting next to. They start to feel like you care about them, which I do, but they feel it. It's not just something that they kind of know about. And it made all the difference for opening people up to answering whatever question I threw at them next, which eventually did circle back to the content. I've been kind of deriding that, but I did focus on that a little bit.
Everybody's laughing. Yeah, thank you. So you've given some examples about like building community and like prioritizing that. And I think, I wonder for people who may be watching or listening to this, like feeling, like that is like a guiding principle of your pedagogy, it sounds like, right? And so people who say, I haven't taught, I don't have a pedagogy, I don't know what that is, like, yeah, you do, like, right? So, Reuben, it sounds like you sat and really thought a lot about what you brought to the table, and that is, you moved from there, you started with your strengths and your own experiences. So I appreciate you sharing that. So I don't know. Is this an assumption? I feel this way about you. I feel like you're someone who just loves to learn and who is always trying to like do your best and do better and improve, even though you're already a superstar. So my question though is, when you first started, inheriting these syllabi, you have to teach this, like the history of caveman to the present economics, or, a different course, like I'm wondering like how you planned for it, or what support, you had, or what support you sought out, what resources you pursued to improve and strengthen your own development and your own learning as a teacher.
Yeah. Well, first off, an aside, I feel like I'm blushing now.
Sorry.
I'm so flattered for all the praise. I appreciate that. It's nice to hear nice things about yourself. I think a lot of my grad school experience has been kind of fighting the kind of like negative self-talk,
Yeah.
that the institution is very good at inculcating.
Yeah.
Yes. So how did I prepare kind of concretely? Like, what resources did I reach out to? That's generally kind of like, yeah. So the kind of history of economics course was kind of the biggest stretch for me. And that was my first teaching experience. And it honestly, it was a bit bumpy. The way the course was designed was pitched as something that would be labor saving for the GSI, but in actuality was exhausting. It required me to comment on student writing every single week for a ton of writing. So I was constantly having to read students' work and to like give kind of like detailed feedback. And that is kind of like the kind of part of teaching that takes the most. And so one of the things I wish I had known then was that I don't have to exploit myself. That it is, I was really afraid to kind of speak up and be like, there is no way that I can reasonably do this in the amount of time that you said that it's supposed to take. But what I ended up actually doing was kind of suffering through it, not really speaking out about it. And I think that, one of the things I kind of feel a little bit guilty about in hindsight is that I didn't raise a bigger kind of institutional stink about how much this course was taking, because now they're like future students that are graduate students that are going to have to teach that course and probably experience the same thing. So I think, which is like a hard thing to ask of students, to kind of like find a kind of institutional voice when they're first getting started. And I don't necessarily, I don't want to blame myself too much for not feeling confident enough to do that at the very beginning. But I think in hindsight, it is worth kind of exploring, if something doesn't work, what are your options for kind of like leaving a record of this, so that maybe others, graduate students that come along, don't have to necessarily kind of experience the exact same thing. But one of the things that did really help me out through that experience was relying on graduate student networks. So every time I've taught, I have like asked around, like who else has taught this course, like who can commiserate with me about how this professor is in this particular area, and like I needed a lot of kind of like reassurance that it was okay to focus on the things that mattered for students and to like cut corners where it made sense for everybody, to save myself, to save them, so like one of the kind of like pieces of advice that graduate students were telling me when I was teaching that course was kind of like, don't stress about these kind of comments, that they're not reading them. Make sure that you're creating moments for them to come and talk to you, in particular in office hours. And when you know that students are going to actually pay attention to your kind of like your feedback, that's when you like really put your energy into it. But the kind of like the way that this particular course is structured, they weren't reading most of my comments that I was writing. And so like other graduate students were like, dude, you don't got time. You don't get time. You don't have energy. Don't give it. Yeah. That's the kind of very specific first teaching experience, which I think was kind of like the bumpiest. But I've also reached out to the university, or like kind of relied on other university teaching resources. So the one that you and I both did together, Laura, and the Engaged Pedagogy Initiative, which was really about kind of bringing a kind of like political standpoint, a community-based standpoint to teaching and learning, to kind of go full circle to the questions that Ebony asked earlier in this interview. This was like a semester-long cohort-based experience where we really talked a lot about what is our pedagogy and how do we kind of make it more expansive than the kind of usual dump content into an empty brain type pedagogical model that is so prevalent in the university. And for me, that was a mostly good experience. I think that it's really valuable. I think it's really valuable that those types of things are offered by universities, but I do have a kind of like nagging kind of like, I think I've almost every single time I've gone into one of those resources, I haven't quite had the kind of leap forward that I was hoping for, if that makes sense. A lot of times I think it has felt a bit kind of like a good review of things I already knew. And I don't want to like write off like every kind of teaching advancement experience that's offered through the university. But it can be a little frustrating sometimes when they don't quite match up with what you kind of like where you're at, which is true of a lot of kind of like professionalization or advancement type programs. It's hard to meet people where they're at. I do want to be like generous and acknowledge that there's a lot of effort that goes into those things, but yeah. I don't really know where to go.
I hear you. I felt like a lot of it was some review for me as well, like learning about who Paulo Freire is. I was like, I mean, I'm from School of Education, I know who that is, but I really valued at least that having that time on the schedule for me meant that I was personally committing to thinking about that more or learning about it more, kind of regardless of what the opportunity itself had to offer, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. So that's motivation for me for other things too. So sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, no, I interrupted you, so I apologize. But I will say that, on this kind of vein of like appreciating the time it carved out for you to kind of like think about those things. One of the things that they did have us do was work on creating our own syllabus at the end. And I actually did find that to be a very useful exercise. And I think everyone brings they're different experiences. I have a lot of experience kind of like working with people. Like I definitely have a kind of like part of me that loves to perform, although I'm not a theater person or anything like that. But I have been in plenty of kind of like people interfacing kind of experiences where it's like just jazz hands or whatever. I get to like kind of dazzle people. And so to me, that kind of interpersonal parts of teaching were things I already felt very comfortable with. But some of the kind of like more planning and syllabus design, writing lectures, those types of things, I didn't feel, I still don't entirely feel like I have the kind of like all the skills that I want in that area. And so I think one of the pieces of advice I would have for graduate students that are coming in and thinking about teaching is to recognize where your strengths are, but recognize where you might also want to grow and to seek out those experiences. So for me, like EPI was really good because I did get to like actually work on developing a course. I also worked with Dr. Melissa Birch in designing the course and the assignments for the crime, criminalization, and punishment course, which was also an incredibly valuable experience to kind of think very concretely, like what what are we going to do with this 90 minutes or whatever that we have twice a week? What kinds of assignments are actually going to get students to where we want them to go, and are not going to kill them or us in order to achieve. And thankfully, I had kind of two passes at that. And so the first time overshot, I forgot the don't kill yourself part of the equation. And then the second time that she and I got to work on that course together, it was a lot about kind of resizing and kind of picking what was most effective. But all that to say, I think what has been most valuable for me has been seeking out those experiences to actually plan for the course. Like, if I was to design this, if I was to build this and to teach this, what would it really entail? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I heard you mention a few things, like peer networking, graduate student networks, faculty support, if that is accessible to people, depending on whose course you're adapting or teaching, or, there are some faculty who will say, I have nothing to do with that course, but I'll help you out. There are a few of them. And then university resources. And the thing that I'm hearing you say that really stands out to me is thinking very strategically about those. Like, what actually is it that you're hoping to develop and strengthen? And then planning and practicing. I have a question that kind of goes back to something that you said kind of earlier, which was, you described that first course as very bumpy, and I used the term, I think you let out a big sigh of relief. You said like exhausting, right? And so I guess my question is, because you were taking your own courses at that time and teaching, and it can be really difficult to be trying to, maybe if it's your first year, there might be grad students who've moved across the country to go to grad school, and they're trying to have a community and make friends, and then you're teaching and you're grading and you're trying to do your own stuff. I was wondering if you had any thoughts or recommendations for like caring for yourself and still finding some rest and re-energizing yourself in these moments of exhaustion. Sounds like you really persevered through the bumpiness a lot, and but are there other things maybe you recommend to people?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a hard thing to figure out. The kind of like caring for yourself. I mean, it's about teaching, but I think it's just graduate school in general. We have our like hands on a lot of pots. What's the saying? Feet in a lot of pools. I don't know. Limbs everywhere. And all of it's really taxing. So I don't know if I can isolate it just to just teaching. But all of it combined, I really had a hard time setting boundaries my first couple years. And so I was really depleted, really exhausted. And definitely like was disconnected from myself. And so I think, there's all kinds of like little self-care things you can point to people about, like, take a day off on the weekend, or make sure you, I had a mentor that used to say, eat, sleep, and exercise, ESE, over and over and over again. Those are all really important things, can't be like underplayed. But I think for me, the thing that I have since realized that I needed more than anything was to separate my understanding of myself from the work that I was doing. So what happens at the university, whether it's in the classroom that I'm leading or the classroom that I'm in as a student, or whether I get grants or don't get grants, it's not a reflection on my value as a human being. That was the hardest lesson to learn, because I could very easily say that, everyone knows that in a kind of like objective kind of way, but you have to believe it about yourself, that really, like, I matter, even if I like am not very good at some of these things, or most of them, or any of them at all. It doesn't matter. Like, you still like value as a human, you still have value as a human being. The people in your life, for many of us, are hopefully, I should qualify this, are going to love us no matter what, and certainly, like, we can build communities that are going to love us no matter what, even if the ones that we inherit are not the ones that are going to do that kind of automatically like they ought to. But I think I, especially in the first couple of years, could have like really, I would have really benefited from just feeling like, okay, maybe I'm not good at teaching. Okay, maybe I'm not good at grant writing. And like, I still like, I'm a rock star in other areas. I'm a really good cook. I like have really good friendships with people. Like, I like all kinds of things, and I enjoy having a good time. It's like all these other things that make me like who I am and really valuable. And it's the graduate school in general really tries to make you feel like it is the entire world, and it is not. And so drawing that line is kind of very vital.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Reuben. Those words are so important. Thank you. So I'm gonna slide it back to Ebony for a few more minutes.
So I had a few follow-up questions, so we'll see how much we could fit in the next like 10 minutes.
Okay.
But one of the things you mentioned is that I think is really important to note is the ways in which graduate students can be exploited, right? In the university, there's power dynamics at play. Everywhere there's power dynamics at play, right? And one thing that you mentioned was like being able to voice like when these things are happening, right, to you. And so one thing I wanted to ask was, now that you are further along, right? And maybe there's a graduate student this is their first year teaching, and they see the same things that you saw then. What advice, now you're much more mature graduate self, would you give to someone who is in that same position that you were in before, where there's this ton of work that's probably much more than the 10 hours a week they say is supposed to go to teaching, or whatever the case may be? What advice would you give them in terms of finding their voice, or voicing maybe their frustration or their needs, or the fact that this is exploitation that might be taking place?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I would say is like, it can happen to you, and and it can happen when people are like, when professors are well-intentioned and nice. I think I was kind of in denial about like, oh, I was the type of person that would say something if like, if there's this kind of chronic problem, or this professor is like a nice guy, I don't think that this is, I don't want to like rock the boat with them or whatever. Like, I think the kind of first step is being like, this thing happens in healthy relationships, and it happens to everyone. So that would be the first piece of advice. The second piece, I mean, I don't know, it feels very kind of specific to the University of Michigan or to like universities that have graduate student unions. But for me, the recourse that I would have taken in hindsight would have been to like work more closely with my union to see what kind of documentation I needed to kind of like very clearly indicate that this was a problem, and to like get some kind of movement towards making the course kind of fundamentally different. And that doesn't necessarily have to like rise to the level of like arbitration or something like really terrifying. The unions, at least at the University of Michigan, is really good at kind of being like, here are your options. Some of them, are require us to take action, but some of them are, departmental. We can give you advice on that, and we can like accompany you while you kind of like pursue those avenues. So I think for me, the second step would have been to reach out to my union. If you have a union, I think that's the way to go. If you're at a school without a graduate student union, first off, organize, get one started.
That's really the one that has one. No.
Yeah. Seriously, and I mean, joking aside, like that was a big part of my calculation for coming to the University of Michigan in particular, because we have such a strong, long-standing graduate student union, and I said, well, who's going to protect me, and who's going to make sure that I get the kind of like living wage and healthcare and whatever that every human deserves. So organize if you don't have one. But if you don't have one, I would maybe like, it's always easier to do things with somebody else. So find, that other graduate student that you can rely on, that maybe is a bit older, that has a bit more experience, that can like sit in with, conversations with the administrator with you, or kind of help you come up with a strategic game plan for talking to your professor about your workload, that kind of stuff. I think, sorry, I'll let you.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just reflecting though, like there's also intangibles about what makes those things hard. So Laura Ann, you like said earlier that I like sighed when I kind of like thought about this course, and it made me remember like why that course is also so challenging too, was that like here I was very interested in race and kind of cities and kind of like politics and left politics, not just any politics, left politics. And then I started teaching this course on the history of the economy, which was like the #1 course for like white business bros who have to take a crossover class with in the humanities. So I taught 75 students that semester, and I had 3 women. The rest were men. Almost all were from the business school. So that's just, it was so, and so many of them were white. So not what this little kind of like femi, like queer Black grad student was like kind of like prepared for. So I felt like I was shucking and jiving like a little bit, and that's I think also why it was exhausting. But there's no kind of like recourse for that. Some of it's just like just find your outlets to complain.
I mean, it's real. It's real. It's really interesting in terms of like thinking about, because I just think about all the times that Laura and I leave class and we're like, okay, so this is what happened in class today. I need your support mentally, emotionally. And so that's something also to think about. So we've also in our episodes have talked a bit about like, if you're looking to apply to graduate school, here are some things you should think about, right? So we did an episode on like PWI or HBCU, you know what I mean? Or things like that. And I think you bring up a really good point that as folks are thinking about applying to grad school, they need to also think about who they want to teach, right? Or thinking about, because that's something I didn't think about. I was just like, ooh, you know, you're gonna pay for my education. I got healthcare. I can live. Let's go, you know. So another thing for folks to think about is like, okay, am I teaching to the community that I would eventually want to teach to if I went to academia, right?
Mhm.
You know, things like that. So like even taking into consideration who you're going to be teaching, the student body, et cetera. You know, for the school
Mhm.
that I'm going to start working at, it's a very diverse school. It's a state school, and it's just very diverse. But this is the first time I'm actually attending working at a university that's so diverse. I've only
Mhm.
gone to PWI, so it's very
Yeah.
different, right? So just for folks to think about like what is the type of university you want to attend, is the racial demographics important to you, is the socioeconomic demographics, do you want to be in a school that is very diverse in many different social identities, etc. Like that matters too,
Mhm.
because you're then impacted by what you teach and who you teach and how long you have to teach. So that's
Mhm.
something else I think folks need to think about as well. Um, did you want to say anything, or I thought you were going to say something?
Yeah, no, sorry. I think, I completely affirm that that kind of like way of thinking about it. Like I don't know that I would have. I mean, so going to the University of Michigan was a little bit of a difference for me. So like I had gone to like a private school, private PWI before this, and when I applied to grad school, I said, I don't want to do this private school thing again. Let me apply to a state school. And so I only applied to state schools, but then ended up choosing the one that's most like a private school. So I don't know. don't pull on that thread too much. uh, but I think that the kind of community that you want to be a part of, to teach and to learn from, I think is absolutely something you want to consider.
Mhm. Yeah. So there was something else that was really interesting. It's kind of taking us a little off the teaching track, but it's related. Okay.
Okay.
So you spoke a bit about like the continuum of like knowledge of equity and justice and community-based knowledge, or even the continuum that we're on in terms of pedagogical knowledge. So in the program you talked about like, hey, these things kind of repeated for me, right?
Hmm.
They're just some foundational things that I already knew. And I was just wondering, in what ways do you think universities might be able to provide professional development for folks who are further along on the continuum? I don't know if you've taken time to think about that, but
Yeah.
it's something that I think when folks go to their universities, it's something that they can say, oh, you know, I'm not finding things for me. I'm further along in the continuum. Maybe this is something I can ask for. Or this is something that we can
Hmm.
bring a speaker in for, or et cetera. So
Hmm.
it's just being further along in that continuum of having like justice-based knowledge and pedagogical knowledge. What would have supported you better as an instructor? Um, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that's really hard to answer. But you know, uh, I think my kind of like thinking about pedagogy, is that people learn best when they are really wrestling with the problems themselves.
Mm,
So like you have an issue and you're trying to do something about it, or you're trying to like unpack it, or to think about, really like getting into it, but in an experiential kind of way. And so for me, I think that what there with where I'm at with the kind of like experiences I had prior to this around kind of engaged pedagogy, I think what I need is practice.
mm,
I need to go out and experience these things. So, which is complicated when you're talking about community-based courses, because that's all about relationships and you can't just drop in and out of those. And so I think honestly, the kind of like most useful thing that I could have had would have been to like be a GSI and a course that was already established,
mm,
and doing these kind of like engaged pedagogy things, and to like have some like one-on-one kind of conversations about pedagogy with the professor that had designed it, which is a very high touch kind of way of saying, next step, but I don't see kind of like just like the kind of content dump like stuff really being that much. I don't think I could like get too much more from that with where I'm at right now.
That makes sense. Because like at the end of the day, like practice and application is like how you then take what you learned and take it to another level. So that makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned a few things that you wish you knew about university teaching that you didn't know initially. One is like finding that voice, you know. Are there any other things that you wish you knew that you would share with our audience for them to maybe think about prior to starting their teaching at a university?
I'm not sure that I have any additional things, but you know, there are, I think I did say a few of them, like one of them being think about what part of kind of teaching you maybe don't have as much kind of experience in and seek those out. For me, that was like the kind of course building, the lecture building. And so for me, that was included like working with professors to design their courses. That was an experience that I found to be incredibly useful. And I think also recognizing that there's kind of content questions, and then there are kind of like what kinds of learning spaces are you building questions, and I think kind of recognizing that you can have different amounts of kind of skills in either one of those areas, and actually kind of doing an accounting of where your skills are is an important thing, and to let go a lot of it actually about kind of like perfect content imparting content perfectly. And yeah, I think that those are the kind of things I wish I had known beforehand or whatever.
So last question, do you have any final advice that you would give to graduate students who are going into teaching, are already teaching? Yeah, so any advice that you would have, any final advice you would have for graduate student instructors?
Yeah, you know, one of the most important conversations I had with another graduate student was shortly before I started teaching for the first time. And up until that point, all the other grad students had just complained about teaching. And they were like, oh, it's so hard, I don't have enough time, blah, 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 blah. Real things. I'm not discounting them. I've said them all in this conversation. So they're not unreal. But this graduate student was like, yeah, teaching's my favorite part. And that was like, oh, yeah, I can enjoy this. And that like made all the difference, to realize that like most things in life, there are things about there are things that we love, and they also still have kind of downsides sometimes. But I think it's important to like not forget that teaching can be something that is really, really enjoyable. And to not let the kind of, I think especially the culture of grad students and the kind of dourness of them let you become too jaded before you even get into the experience.
Yeah, well, you're preaching to the choir, because Laura Ann and I love it. You got some company here, okay?
You know, I always get irritated when people are like, I have to go grade these essays or tests and all my students did terribly. I'm like, well, who made the assessment? And who prepared the students for that assessment?
Yeah.
Was it you? You have some, you know, agency here as well.
Responsibility,
But I do love that. Yeah, you can love teaching. The culture, there's a lot of culture on a lot of things in graduate school, whether it's writing a paper or going to a class or teaching a course or whatever it is. There's a lot of like, we are jaded. When you said jaded earlier, it's like, yeah. But yeah, you know, there is a lot of that goes around, but there's a lot of joy to be had in a lot of spaces too. So I appreciate you saying that, Reuben.
Yeah, thank you so much, Reuben, for sharing your wisdom. We really appreciate it. I know that our viewers are going to definitely benefit for you sharing your experience.
Sure.
It's so important that we create spaces where we can talk to each other about, the challenges of graduate school, you know what I'm saying? And also the joys and the affordances and all those things, I think is all wrapped up into one. And I think teaching is one of those things too. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys for pulling this together and for, the whole, well, I don't know if we need to name this as actually the name of the thing, or if that's actually, it's just a fill-in, but
Yeah,
whatever
it's the name
you're
of the
calling
thing.
this. Okay.
It started as a fill-in, and then I was like,
It's so
that could
funny.
be the name.
Yes, that's exactly what happened. I said, Lauren Ann, we want to do this project. And I was like, we need to name this. And she was like, yeah, that should be the title. We need to name it. And I was like, oh, I see what you did there.
Yeah, no, I didn't do
Yeah.
anything. I was confused and thought you had named it. So
Well, the confusion lives on in me. So, but now I'm clear. But I think, yeah, thank you guys for pulling together the whole thing. And I hope that, this stuff is turns out to, be useful for people.
Thank you for joining us for We Need to Name This, a series where we unpack the hidden curriculum of academe. Join us for our next episode, Prelims, Scholarly Papers, and Dissertations, with Gabrielle Elizabeth Bernal and Dr. Christine Quince. For more information, visit www.weneedtonamethis.com.